tell you about a morning in ancient Athens, when the world measured time not by the frantic ticking of devices that hadn't yet been dreamed of, but by the gentle progression of shadows across marble steps and the gradual warming of clay beneath patient hands. This was the 5th century before our modern era, when philosophers argued in the agora about the nature of reality while potters quietly went about the business of actually creating it, one vessel at a time. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern hills with that particular shade of gold that seems to exist only in memory and in Greece, filtering through the olive trees with the sort of lazy confidence that comes from knowing it has been performing this same ritual for countless generations. Young Nikias, for that was our apprentice's name, chosen by parents who had hoped their son might achieve victory in something, though they had probably envisioned battlefield glory rather than the conquest of particularly stubborn lumps of clay, stirred on his simple straw mattress as the first rays found their way through the workshop's eastern window. The pottery workshop of Kleomenes was beginning to wake from its nightly slumber, dust motes dancing in the early light like tiny spirits celebrating the promise of another day's honest work. Now, dear friend, if you find yourself drawn to this tale of ancient clay and patient craftsmanship, perhaps you might honor us with a small gesture of appreciation. A like, as they say in the modern parlance, or even better, join our circle of those who treasure slow stories and forgotten arts. After all, there are still 3 more parts of this gentle day waiting to unfold, and I do so prefer telling tales to those who truly wish to hear them. Nikias had been apprenticed to Master Kleomenes for nearly 2 years now, long enough to have progressed from the utterly hopeless stage to what might charitably be called the merely incompetent level. His hands, once soft as any well-born Athenian youth's, now bore the permanent reddish stain of clay beneath his fingernails and the small scars that come from learning, through painful experience, that freshly fired pottery retains heat longer than one might optimistically assume. The workshop itself was a testament to the accumulated wisdom of generations of potters. The main room stretched wide and airy, with large windows facing east to catch the morning light that was so essential for evaluating the color and consistency of clay. Along the walls stood rows of shelves holding vessels in various stages of completion, some leather-hard and waiting for decoration, others bone-dry and ready for their first firing, still others glazed and awaiting their final transformation in the kiln's fierce embrace. The floor was packed earth, swept clean but permanently stained with decades of clay dust and the occasional spectacular collapse of ambitious projects. In the center of the room stood the potter's wheel, not the mechanized marvel that later generations would devise, but a simple disc of smooth stone balanced on a wooden spindle, turned by foot power and maintained by patient practice. Around it, like courtiers attending a king, sat smaller tools. Ribs of wood and metal for smoothing, wires for cutting, sponges for moistening, and brushes of various sizes for the application of slip and glaze. But it was the clay itself that dominated the workshop's character. It seemed to be everywhere, not merely in the obvious places like the bins where it waited to be worked, but also in the mortar between the stones, ground into the wooden workbenches, and somehow managing to appear on surfaces that logically should never have encountered pottery at all. Master Kleomenes often joked that clay was like a faithful dog. Once it adopted you, it followed you everywhere, whether you wanted its company or not. Nikias sat up slowly, his body protesting the movement with the particular stiffness that comes from spending the previous day hunched over clay that seemed determined to collapse the moment he stopped paying attention to it. His sleeping area was a small alcove off the main workshop, separated by a curtain of rough-woven cloth that provided the illusion of privacy while still allowing the sounds and smells of the pottery to remind him, even in sleep, of his chosen craft. The morning air carried that distinctive scent that belonged uniquely to the workshop, the earthy smell of raw clay mixed with the sharper notes of wood ash from the kiln, the faint sweetness of olive oil used to keep tools from rusting, and something else, something indefinable that might have been the accumulated essence of thousands of pots created and fired within these walls. It was a smell that had worked its way so deeply into the very stones of the building that Nikias sometimes imagined it would linger long after the last potter had set aside his tools and walked away. He reached for the water jug beside his bed, a simple piece, one of his own early attempts that leaked slightly around the base but which Master Kleomenes had declared adequate for apprentice use, which was both encouragement and gentle reminder wrapped in a single phrase. The water was cool and clean, drawn the evening before from the public fountain that supplied this quarter of the city. As he splashed it on his face, Nikias felt the last vestiges of sleep wash away, replaced by that peculiar mixture of anticipation and mild dread that marked the beginning of another day's learning. Through the thin wall that separated the workshop from the master's quarters, he could hear the soft sounds of Master Kleomenes beginning his own morning routine. The old potter, though at 53, he was hardly ancient by any reasonable measure, had his own rituals as fixed and predictable as the rising sun. First would come the careful examination of the previous day's work, checking for cracks that might have appeared overnight, noting which pieces were ready for the next stage of their creation. Then the preparation of clay for the day's throwing, the ancient dance of wedging that removed air bubbles and aligned the particles in preparation for their transformation. Nikias dressed himself in his working tunic, a garment that had once been white but had long since surrendered to the inevitable staining that came with proximity to clay. Over this went a leather apron, also permanently discolored, that provided some protection for his clothes while making him look, he hoped, more like a serious craftsman and less like a youth who still occasionally forgot which end of a brush to hold. His feet, like those of most Greeks, were usually bare within the workshop. The packed earth floor was smooth enough to walk on comfortably, and bare feet provided better purchase when working at the wheel, where balance and stability were essential. Besides, shoes were expensive, and clay was merciless to leather. Better to wash feet each evening than to replace footwear every few months. As he emerged from his alcove, Nikias was greeted by the sight that never failed to fill him with a mixture of wonder and intimidation. The workshop in the early morning waiting. The potters will stood silent and ready, surrounded by the tools of transformation. Shelves lined with vessels in various stages of completion seemed to watch him with the patient judgment of those who had successfully navigated the journey from shapeless clay to functional art. Near the eastern window, Master Kleomenes was already at work, his hands moving with the unconscious precision that came from 30 years of practice. He was wedging clay, the essential preparation that transformed the raw material from a collection of particles into a cohesive, workable medium. His movements were rhythmic, almost meditative, lifting, folding, pressing, turning. The clay responded to his touch like a willing partner in an ancient dance. "Good morning, Nikias," the master said without looking up from his work. "The clay is speaking well today. Can you hear what it's saying?" This was one of Master Kleomenes' peculiarities. His insistence that clay had moods, preferences, opinions about the weather and the phases of the moon. When Nikias had first arrived, he had assumed these were metaphors, colorful ways of describing the technical properties of the material. 2 years of daily contact with clay had taught him that perhaps the master was being more literal than metaphorical. "It sounds cooperative?" Nikias ventured, earning a small smile from his teacher. "Indeed, yesterday it was sullen, resistant. Today it seems ready to work with us rather than against us. Such things matter more than you might think." Nikias nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he understood. His relationship with clay was still primarily adversarial, an ongoing negotiation in which the clay seemed to hold most of the advantages. When he worked at the wheel, he often felt less like a craftsman shaping material and more like a diplomat trying to convince a foreign dignitary to do something reasonable. The workshop was beginning to fill with that particular quality of light that craftsmen treasured: clear, steady, revealing. It was the sort of light that showed clay's true color, that revealed flaws and imperfections while also highlighting the subtle beauties that emerged from skilled hands. Through the windows, Nikias could see the city beginning to stir. Smoke rising from cooking fires, the distant sound of voices in the agora, the clip-clop of donkey hooves on stone streets. Master Kleomenes finished his wedging and divided the clay into portions suitable for the day's work. Each piece was roughly spherical, sitting on the workbench like oversized eggs waiting to hatch into amphora or cups or whatever form the potter's imagination and skill might coax from their humble substance. "Today," the master announced, "we will work on symmetry, not merely the obvious symmetry that the eye can see, but the deeper symmetry that the hands can feel. A pot may look perfectly round but feel unbalanced in the hand. A vessel may appear slightly asymmetrical but sit with perfect stability on a table." This was another of Master Kleomenes' philosophical tendencies, his ability to find profound meaning in the most practical aspects of pottery. Nikias had learned to listen carefully to these pronouncements, as they often contained insights that wouldn't become clear until days or weeks later, when his hands suddenly understood what his mind had been struggling to grasp. The morning light continued its slow journey across the workshop floor, painting everything in that warm, golden glow that made even humble clay vessels look noble and significant. Outside, a gull cried, one of the many that had followed the ships into Piraeus and now made their living scavenging the scraps of a great trading city. As if summoned by some invisible signal, that very gull appeared at the open window, its bright black eye surveying the workshop with the calculating gaze of a creature that had learned to see opportunity in the most unlikely places. It perched on the windowsill with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there, its head cocked at an angle that suggested it was evaluating not just the workshop's potential for providing breakfast, but perhaps also the aesthetic merits of the pottery displayed within. Master Kleomenes glanced at the bird and chuckled. "Ah, our critic has arrived. Aristophanes, punctual as always." The gull, apparently named after the great comic playwright, though Nikias had never dared ask why, fixed the master with a stare that seemed to demand an accounting of the day's plans, as if the bird were some sort of feathered supervisor sent by the gods to ensure that proper artistic standards were maintained. "Yes, yes," Master Kleomenes said to the bird. "We'll have something for you presently, but first the work." And with that, another day in the ancient pottery workshop began in earnest, measured not by the mechanical counting of hours but by the patient rhythm of hands shaping clay and the gentle progression of shadows across the floor. Now, you might imagine that a young man who had spent 2 years learning the potter's craft would approach his wheel with something resembling confidence. But Nikias, settling himself cross-legged before the stone disc that would either grant him success or mock his efforts with spectacular failure, felt rather like a gladiator entering the arena to face a particularly unpredictable opponent, one made entirely of clay. Master Kleomenes had selected what he deemed a cooperative portion of clay for Nikias to work with, though the apprentice suspected that clay's definition of cooperation might differ significantly from his own. The lump sat in the center of the wheel like a small, brownish challenge, roughly the size of a man's head but considerably less predictable in its behavior. "Remember," the master said, settling into his own position at the larger wheel nearby, "the clay must be convinced, not commanded. Think of it as a conversation rather than a conquest." This was easier said than done. Nikias placed his feet against the wooden treadles that would power the wheel and began the familiar rhythm of pedaling. The stone disc responded sluggishly at first, then found its momentum, spinning with that hypnotic steadiness that was simultaneously soothing and terrifying. Too slow, and the clay would remain stubbornly unresponsive. Too fast, and it would fly apart in all directions, decorating the workshop and the potter with impressive but artistically valueless splashes of mud. He dipped his hands in the bowl of water beside his wheel. Always clean water, Master Kleomenes insisted, because clay could sense disrespect from yards away, and approached his spinning opponent. The first touch was crucial, like the opening move in a game of strategy. Press too hard, and the clay would collapse in defeat. Too gently, and it would ignore him entirely. The clay was cool and surprisingly smooth beneath his palms, responding to his touch with what felt almost like recognition. For a moment, Nikias felt that mysterious connection that Master Kleomenes spoke of, the sense that potter and clay were partners in some ancient dance of creation. Then the moment passed, the clay developed what could only be described as an attitude problem, and the real work began. Centering the clay was the fundamental skill that separated actual potters from enthusiastic amateurs. It required the sort of patience that young men are not naturally blessed with, combined with a delicate balance of pressure and persistence. The clay had to be coaxed into perfect alignment with the wheel's center. Not merely close, but exact, because even the smallest deviation would magnify into wobbling disaster as the vessel grew. Nikias pressed his palms against the spinning clay, feeling for that sweet spot where the material would surrender its chaotic impulses and submit to proper organization. The clay pushed back, as clay always did, testing his resolve and his technique. It was remarkably similar to training a particularly willful horse, except that horses generally didn't try to coat their trainers in mud. "Patience, Nikias," Master Kleomenes murmured from his own wheel, where a graceful amphora was already taking shape beneath his experienced hands. The clay can sense your frustration. It feeds on impatience like a flame feeds on oil. This was probably true, though Nikias sometimes suspected that clay's alleged sensitivity to human emotions was simply a polite way of saying that beginners were naturally terrible at pottery. Still, he forced himself to breathe slowly, to release the tension in his shoulders, to approach the spinning clay with something approaching serenity. Gradually, miraculously, the clay began to respond. The wobbling decreased, the resistance lessened, and suddenly, there it was, centered, perfectly, beautifully centered, spinning with the smooth confidence of a planet in its orbit. Nikias felt a surge of triumph that he carefully suppressed, knowing that clay was quite capable of sensing overconfidence and punishing it accordingly. Aristophanes the gull had been watching this process with the sort of intense interest usually reserved for particularly engaging theatrical performances. The bird cocked its head at various angles, as if evaluating Nikias's technique from multiple perspectives, occasionally emitting small sounds that might have been encouragement or criticism. It was impossible to tell which. Now came the next challenge: opening the clay. With infinite care, Nikias pressed his thumb into the center of the spinning lump, creating the hollow that would eventually become the interior of whatever vessel he was attempting to create. The clay parted with surprising willingness, as if it had finally decided to trust him with its transformation. Deeper, deeper, but not too deep, because breaking through to the wheel surface below was a catastrophe that would require starting over with fresh clay and wounded pride. The walls of his embryonic pot began to take shape, rising around his thumb like the curved walls of a tiny amphitheater. "Good," Master Kleomenes said, his own hands never pausing in their work. "Now you must decide what this clay wishes to become. Listen to its voice." This was one of the master's more mystical pronouncements, and Nikias had learned not to dismiss them out of hand. After 2 years of wrestling with clay, he was beginning to understand that different pieces of clay did indeed seem to have preferences. Some wanted to become tall and elegant, others preferred to remain low and broad. Fighting against these inclinations usually resulted in collapsed vessels and frustrated potters. The clay beneath his hands felt substantial, grounded, more inclined toward sturdy functionality than graceful decoration. A bowl, then, or perhaps a simple cup, something that would sit solidly on a table and hold whatever liquid was poured into it without philosophical objections or aesthetic pretensions. Nikias began the delicate process of pulling up the walls, his fingers working in careful coordination as the wheel spun. Too much pressure and the clay would tear. Too little and it would remain stubbornly thick and unresponsive. Each movement had to be deliberate, considered part of an ongoing conversation between potter and material. The morning light had strengthened while he worked, and now illuminated the workshop with that clear, revealing quality that made every detail sharp and significant. Dust motes danced in the slanted beams, and the various vessels on the shelves seemed to glow with their own inner light. Outside, the sounds of Athens awakening grew more pronounced, voices calling in the agora, the rumble of cart wheels on stone streets, the distant hammering of metalworkers beginning their day. But within the workshop, time moved to its own rhythm, measured not by the passage of hours but by the gradual transformation of shapeless clay into purposeful form. Nikias found himself falling into that meditative state that all craftsmen know, where consciousness narrows to focus on the immediate task while some deeper part of the mind takes over the work. His pot was growing, rising from the wheel with surprising grace. The walls were even, the curve pleasing, the whole vessel developing that indefinable quality that separates successful pottery from mere shaped mud. For once, Nikias felt that he and the clay were genuinely collaborating rather than competing. Master Kleomenes glanced over at his apprentice's work and nodded approvingly. "Much better. You're beginning to trust the process rather than fighting it." This was high praise indeed, coming from a master who believed that excessive encouragement could lead to complacency. Nikias felt a warm glow of satisfaction but kept his attention focused on the spinning clay, knowing that pride had brought down many a promising pot at the crucial moment. Aristophanes chose this moment to abandon his perch at the window and flutter down to investigate the workshop more closely. The gull landed on a nearby shelf with the casual authority of someone who had been granted permanent visiting privileges, causing several small bowls to rattle nervously. its bright black eye fixed on Nikias's work with what appeared to be professional interest. "Ah," said Master Kleomenes. "Our supervisor has decided to conduct a closer inspection. Aristophanes takes his duties seriously." The bird indeed seemed to be studying the pot with considerable attention, occasionally tilting its head to view it from different angles. Nikias couldn't help feeling that he was being evaluated by a critic whose standards were both mysterious and inexorably high. The clay continued to rise beneath his hands, taking on the solid, purposeful form of a drinking cup, nothing fancy, but honest and functional. The walls were thick enough to provide insulation for hot liquids, but not so thick as to make the vessel clumsy to hold. The rim was developing a gentle outward curve that would make drinking comfortable and prevent spills. "Symmetry," Master Kleomenes observed, his own amphora now nearing completion with the sort of effortless perfection that came from decades of practice. Not just in shape, but in purpose. A cup that looks beautiful but feels awkward in the hand has failed in its essential duty. This was the sort of philosophical insight that Nikias was gradually learning to appreciate. Pottery, in Master Kleomenes' view, was not merely about creating attractive objects, but about understanding the relationship between form and function, between aesthetic appeal and practical utility. A truly successful pot had to satisfy both the eye and the hand, both the desire for beauty and the need for usefulness. As his cup approached completion, Nikias began to experience that peculiar mixture of satisfaction and anxiety that marked the final stages of any pottery project. The vessel was undoubtedly the best work he had produced in weeks, possibly months. But it was still fragile, still vulnerable to the countless disasters that could befall unfired clay. A careless movement, a structural weakness revealed only when the piece was nearly finished, a moment's inattention. Any of these could transform success into expensive failure. The morning had advanced while he worked, and the workshop was now fully illuminated by strong, clear light. Other sounds from the city filtered through the windows: merchants calling their wares, children playing in the streets, the distant chanting from a temple where the morning sacrifices were being offered to whichever gods were deemed relevant to the day's enterprises. Aristophanes had apparently completed his inspection and found the proceedings satisfactory, because he settled himself more comfortably on his shelf and began what appeared to be a thorough grooming session. The bird's presence had become so familiar that Nikias barely noticed it, except when the occasional flutter of wings reminded him that he was working under avian supervision. Master Kleomenes was putting the finishing touches on his amphora with the sort of casual mastery that made complex techniques look deceptively simple. His hands moved with unconscious precision, creating the elegant curves and proportions that distinguish truly fine pottery from merely competent craftsmanship. Watching him work was both inspiring and slightly depressing. Inspiring because it showed what was possible with enough practice and skill. Depressing because it highlighted how far Nikias still had to travel on his own journey toward mastery. The clay of Nikias's cup was beginning to firm up as the water evaporated from its surface, taking on that leather-hard consistency that marked the transition from wet clay to pottery. Soon it would be ready for its first firing, that mysterious transformation in which clay became ceramic through the alchemy of fire and time. But for now, it was simply a cup, well-formed, properly proportioned, ready to fulfill its humble but essential destiny of holding whatever liquid might be poured into it. Not the most glamorous of pottery forms, perhaps, but honest and functional, which Master Kleomenes always insisted were the highest virtues any pot could aspire to. The wheel gradually slowed as Nikias eased pressure on the treadles, coming to rest with that particular satisfaction that marked the successful completion of a challenging task. His cup sat centered on the stone disc, looking somehow both inevitable and miraculous. Inevitable because its form followed naturally from the properties of clay and the movements of skilled hands. Miraculous because what had begun as a shapeless lump had been transformed into something useful and pleasing. "Well done," Master Kleomenes said simply, and in those two words Nikias heard not just approval but recognition, the acknowledgement that he had taken another small but significant step along the long path toward true craftsmanship. Outside, the morning continued its ancient progression toward noon, measured by the steady movement of shadows across the workshop floor and the gradual warming of the air that spoke of another clear, productive day in the pottery quarter of Athens. The successful completion of a pottery piece, Nikias had learned, creates a peculiar sort of emptiness in the craftsman's mind, not unlike the hollow feeling that follows the end of a particularly engaging conversation. One moment your entire attention is focused on the dialogue between hands and clay, and the next you find yourself sitting before a completed cup, wondering what to do with all that suddenly unoccupied concentration. Master Kleomenes seemed to understand this phenomenon, because he had developed the habit of filling these transitional moments with what he called the essential pause, a deliberate breathing space that allowed both potter and clay to adjust to their new relationship. The clay needed time to firm up and accept its new identity as pottery rather than mere earth, while the potter needed time to shift his focus from the specific challenges of shaping to the broader questions of what came next. "Now," the master said, carefully lifting his own completed amphora from the wheel with the sort of reverence usually reserved for newborn infants, "we must consider the question of decoration. Not whether to decorate, that is a conversation for another day, but whether this particular piece wishes to be decorated, and if so, how it might prefer to be adorned." This was vintage Master Kleomenes' philosophy, the notion that pottery possessed preferences, opinions, and aesthetic sensibilities that needed to be consulted rather than overruled. When Nikias had first encountered this way of thinking, he had assumed it was merely colorful metaphor. 2 years of daily contact with clay had convinced him that perhaps the master was being more literal than he had initially supposed. Nikias examined his cup with the sort of careful attention he had learned to apply to all pottery-related decisions. The vessel sat on its wheel with the quiet dignity of something that had successfully navigated the treacherous journey from shapeless material to functional object. Its proportions were pleasing, its walls even, its rim properly formed for comfortable drinking. But did it want additional ornamentation? The clay seemed to radiate a kind of satisfied simplicity, as if it had achieved exactly what it had been hoping for and saw no need for further embellishment. This was a working cup, honest and unpretentious, designed for the daily business of containing liquids rather than the more rarefied purpose of impressing visitors with its artistic sophistication. "I think," Nikias said slowly, testing the words as if they might flee if spoken too quickly, "it prefers to remain plain, not because it lacks ambition, but because its ambition is to be perfectly itself." Master Kleomenes nodded approvingly. "Good. You're beginning to understand that not every pot aspires to be a masterpiece displayed in wealthy homes. Some pottery finds its highest calling in faithful daily service, and such vessels deserve our respect for their honest simplicity." This distinction between functional pottery and decorative art was one of the subtle philosophical divides that separated different schools of pottery thought. Some masters believed that all ceramic work should strive for maximum beauty and artistic achievement, while others, like Kleomenes, maintained that true craftsmanship lay in creating objects that fulfilled their intended purpose with grace and reliability. The morning had progressed to that stage where serious craftsmen traditionally paused for refreshment, not because the work was particularly exhausting, but because the rhythm of manual labor required periodic breaks to prevent the sort of repetitive strain that could end a potter's career before it properly began. Besides, both master and apprentice had been awake since before dawn, and even the most dedicated craftsman needed fuel to maintain his concentration. Master Kleomenes produced a small wooden tray from a shelf near the window, a tray that bore the unmistakable marks of having been made by a potter rather than purchased from a carpenter. Its edges were slightly uneven, its surface bearing the subtle ripples that come from being shaped by hand rather than carved with tools, but it possessed that indefinable quality of rightness that marks objects created by someone who truly understands their material. On this tray were arranged the components of a modest but satisfying meal. Fresh bread from the baker who lived 3 streets over, soft cheese made from goat's milk, olives that still glistened with their brine, and a small cluster of grapes that had somehow survived the morning without being discovered by the various birds that regularly patrolled the workshop for edible opportunities. The bread was the sort that bakers created for working people rather than wealthy citizens, substantial, nourishing, designed to provide sustained energy rather than delicate pleasure. When Master Kleomenes broke it open, it released that distinctive aroma of wheat and yeast that had been perfected over countless generations of bakers who understood that their customers needed food that would sustain them through long days of physical labor. The cheese was soft enough to spread with a wooden knife, pale yellow in color, with that slightly tangy flavor that spoke of goats who had been grazing on wild herbs rather than cultivated fodder. It paired beautifully with the bread, creating one of those simple combinations that somehow achieved a sum greater than its individual parts. But it was the grapes that proved most interesting to the workshop's unofficial residents. No sooner had Master Kleomenes arranged the food on the tray than Aristophanes began showing signs of intense interest, hopping along his shelf with the sort of focused attention that suggested he was calculating distances and angles of approach. "Ah," said the master, noticing the bird's increasingly obvious intentions. "I believe we're about to receive a visit from our resident fruit critic." Indeed, Aristophanes had apparently decided that the grapes required immediate inspection. The gull launched himself from his shelf with the sort of casual confidence that comes from having performed this particular maneuver many times before, gliding across the workshop in a graceful arc that brought him to a landing on the table beside the food tray. For a moment, bird and potter regarded each other in the sort of standoff that occurs when civilized beings attempt to negotiate the delicate balance between hospitality and theft. Aristophanes cocked his head at an angle that seemed to suggest he was merely interested in examining the grapes for quality control purposes, while Master Kleomenes maintained the expression of someone who had not yet decided whether to be amused or annoyed by this display of avian audacity. The negotiation was brief. Aristophanes, with the lightning-quick reflexes that had enabled his species to survive in a world full of faster, stronger predators, darted forward and seized the largest grape in his beak. He then retreated to a safe distance, approximately 3 feet, which he had apparently calculated as being just beyond the reach of human arms but close enough to make his point about property rights. "Thief," Master Kleomenes said mildly, but without any real irritation. "Every morning the same performance. One would think you were starving, when in fact you receive more free meals than most citizens of Athens." Aristophanes consumed his pilfered grape with the sort of deliberate satisfaction that suggested this was less about hunger and more about maintaining certain established traditions. Having made his statement about the ownership of fruit within the workshop, he settled down to preen his feathers with the air of someone who had successfully completed an important daily ritual. Nikias found himself oddly impressed by the bird's combination of boldness and calculation. There was something almost human about the way Aristophanes had assessed the situation, identified his objective, executed his plan, and then retreated to enjoy the fruits, literally, of his successful strategy. It was rather like watching a very small, very clever thief practice his craft in broad daylight. "Does he do this every day?" Nikias asked, accepting his portion of bread and cheese from Master Kleomenes. "Without fail. Rain or shine, summer or winter, Aristophanes appears at precisely this time and appropriates exactly 1 piece of fruit. Never more, never less. It's become such a reliable occurrence that I've begun setting aside his tribute in advance." This revelation cast the bird's behavior in a different light entirely. What Nikias had interpreted as spontaneous theft was apparently a long-established custom, a daily tribute paid to the workshop's self-appointed avian overseer. The fact that Master Kleomenes not only tolerated but actively facilitated this arrangement spoke to the sort of practical philosophy that accepted the minor inconveniences of coexistence in exchange for the benefits of having a regular observer who could alert the workshop to approaching visitors or unusual events. As if to demonstrate his value as a sentinel, Aristophanes suddenly straightened from his preening and fixed his attention on the workshop's entrance. His posture changed from relaxed supervisory to alert watchfulness, and he emitted a single sharp cry that seemed to serve as some sort of warning signal. Sure enough, moments later, the sound of sandaled feet on stone announced the approach of a visitor. Master Kleomenes set aside his bread and composed himself into the sort of dignified attention that successful craftsmen maintained when conducting business. The visitor who appeared in the workshop doorway was a woman of middle years, dressed in the practical but well-made clothing that marked her as belonging to the comfortable merchant class. She carried herself with the sort of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what she wanted and having the resources to obtain it. "Master Kleomenes," she said, inclining her head in the polite greeting that acknowledged his status as a respected craftsman. "I am Melania, wife of Demetrios the olive oil merchant. I come seeking your expertise in a matter of some delicacy." This was the sort of formal opening that usually preceded either a very interesting commission or a very complicated problem, sometimes both. Master Kleomenes set aside his meal entirely and gave the visitor his complete attention. You honor my workshop with your presence, Lady Melania. How may I be of service? My daughter is to be married next month, Melania explained, and I wish to commission a special set of pottery for her new household. Not ordinary vessels, but pieces that will reflect both the importance of the occasion and the refined tastes of her future family. Nikias felt his pulse quicken slightly. This was the sort of commission that could establish a potter's reputation among the wealthy families of Athens, if executed successfully. It was also the sort of project that could destroy that same reputation if anything went wrong. Master Kleomenes listened to the details with the sort of careful attention that had made him successful in a trade where artistic skill had to be balanced against practical considerations. The commission would include a complete symposium set, mixing bowls for wine, drinking cups of various sizes, serving platters, and amphora for storage. Each piece would need to be not only functional but beautiful, decorated with designs that would complement the bride's new home while demonstrating the family's wealth and cultural sophistication. The timeline is ambitious, Master Kleomenes said thoughtfully, but not impossible. The designs you describe are well within my capabilities, though they will require considerable time and attention to execute properly. As the negotiations continued, Nikias found himself studying both the visitor and his master's responses with the sort of intense interest that comes from observing a master craftsman navigate the delicate balance between artistic integrity and commercial necessity. This was an aspect of the pottery trade that he was only beginning to understand, the way in which successful potters had to be not only skilled artisans but also astute businesspeople, capable of evaluating both the technical feasibility and the financial viability of complex commissions. Aristophanes, meanwhile, had returned to his shelf and resumed his role as workshop supervisor, though Nikias noticed that the bird kept one eye fixed on the remaining grapes. Apparently, even the most disciplined thieves found it difficult to resist the temptation of unguarded fruit, regardless of how well-established their daily quotas might be. The morning light had continued its steady progression across the workshop floor, and now illuminated the space with that clear, revealing quality that made every detail sharp and significant. Outside, the sounds of Athens conducting its daily business provided a constant background murmur, the rumble of cart wheels, the calls of merchants, the distant chanting from various temples where the morning sacrifices were being offered to the city's patron deities. But within the pottery workshop, time moved to its own rhythm, measured not by the mechanical passage of hours but by the patient processes of creation and the careful negotiations that would transform artistic vision into practical reality. The negotiations between Master Kleomenes and the olive merchant's wife had reached that delicate stage where artistic vision meets practical reality, and both parties carefully weigh the balance between ambition and possibility. Nikias found himself in the peculiar position of being both invisible observer and inadvertent participant, as his master occasionally glanced in his direction when discussing the more labor-intensive aspects of the proposed commission. The symposium set you describe, Master Kleomenes was saying, his hands moving in small, precise gestures that seemed to sketch invisible pottery in the air, will require approximately 6 weeks to complete properly. The clay must be selected with particular care, the throwing done in stages to ensure uniformity across the set, and the decoration will demand the sort of attention that cannot be rushed without compromising the final result. Melania nodded thoughtfully, her practiced eye evaluating not just the master's words but his entire workshop. Nikias noticed that her gaze lingered on the shelves of completed pottery, taking inventory of the quality and style of work produced here. This was clearly a woman who understood that commissioning fine pottery involved more than simply placing an order. It required confidence in the craftsman's ability to transform clay into objects worthy of a wealthy household. "I have seen examples of your work in the homes of my friends," she said, which was both compliment and subtle pressure. "The wine cups you created for Lysander's wife are particularly admired. Could you produce something in a similar style, but perhaps with decorative elements that reflect my daughter's new status as a married woman?" This reference to previous work was significant, Nikias realized. In the pottery trade, reputation was built one successful commission at a time, and each satisfied customer became a source of referrals to their social circle. The cups Melania mentioned had apparently achieved that crucial transition from functional pottery to conversation pieces, objects that guests noticed and inquired about. Master Kleomenes considered the request with the sort of careful attention that all successful craftsmen brought to the delicate task of interpreting a customer's wishes without being bound by their potentially impractical expectations. Indeed, that style would be appropriate for a wedding commission. The vine motifs speak to fertility and abundance, while the geometric borders suggest order and harmony in the household. As they spoke, Aristophanes had been conducting what appeared to be a surveillance operation on the remaining grapes. The bird had repositioned himself several times, each move bringing him slightly closer to the fruit while maintaining the pretense that he was simply adjusting his perch for better light or more comfortable viewing of the business proceedings. Nikias found himself oddly fascinated by the gull's strategy. There was something almost mathematical about the way Aristophanes calculated angles and distances, timing his movements to coincide with moments when human attention was focused elsewhere. It was like watching a very small, very patient general planning a campaign against a numerically superior but less motivated enemy. The negotiations continued, with Master Kleomenes sketching rough designs on a piece of broken pottery that served as an impromptu drawing surface. His quick, confident lines captured the essential elements of drinking cups, mixing bowls, and serving platters, each drawn with the sort of economical precision that comes from decades of visualizing pottery before creating it. The red figure technique, he explained, indicating certain areas of his sketches, will allow for more detailed figurative work, perhaps scenes from the wedding procession or symbolic representations of domestic harmony. The black figure style, while more traditional, might seem somewhat old-fashioned for such a modern bride. This discussion of decorative techniques revealed another layer of complexity in the potter's trade. The choice between red figure and black figure pottery was not merely aesthetic but cultural, carrying implications about the commissioning family's taste, sophistication, and position within Athenian society. A wealthy merchant's daughter marrying into an established family would require pottery that demonstrated both artistic knowledge and social awareness. Nikias listened to this conversation with the sort of intense concentration that comes from recognizing the educational value of observing master craftsmen conduct business. This was knowledge that could not be learned from practice alone. The subtle negotiation between artistic vision and customer expectations, the delicate balance between technical possibility and commercial viability. Meanwhile, Aristophanes had apparently decided that the humans were sufficiently distracted by their business discussion to permit a strategic advance on the grape situation. The bird made his move with the sort of casual confidence that suggested this was merely routine maintenance rather than outright theft. But Melania, despite her apparent focus on pottery designs, possessed the sort of peripheral awareness that comes from years of managing a household where vigilance was essential. She noticed the gull's approach immediately. "Oh!" she exclaimed, not with alarm but with genuine delight. "What a beautiful bird! And how bold! He seems quite at home here." This reaction clearly surprised Aristophanes, who had expected either indifference or irritation from the visiting human. Instead, he found himself the object of admiring attention, which seemed to confuse his carefully planned grape acquisition strategy. He paused mid-approach, apparently uncertain whether to continue with his mission or acknowledge the unexpected praise. "That is Aristophanes," Master Kleomenes explained with evident affection. "He has appointed himself supervisor of workshop operations, a position he takes quite seriously. He also maintains certain traditional rights regarding fruit distribution." "Traditional rights?" Melania asked, clearly intrigued by this unexpected aspect of pottery workshop management. "1 grape per day," Nikias found himself saying, then immediately worried that he had spoken out of turn. But Master Kleomenes smiled approvingly, and Melania seemed charmed rather than offended by the apprentice's contribution to the conversation. "How delightfully civilized," she said. "A workshop with its own resident philosopher-critic. I approve entirely." Then, to Aristophanes directly, "Please, don't let our business interrupt your established routines." This formal permission seemed to restore the bird's confidence. With a dignity that would have impressed the most protocol-conscious bureaucrat, Aristophanes completed his approach to the grape cluster, selected a particularly fine specimen, and retreated to his shelf to consume it with the sort of ceremonial attention that elevated simple eating into a form of performance art. The business discussion resumed, But the atmosphere had subtly shifted. Melania's discovery of the workshop's avian resident had apparently convinced her that this was a place where attention was paid to details and traditions, exactly the sort of establishment that could be trusted with an important family commission. "I think," she said, examining Master Kleomenes' sketches with evident satisfaction, "that we understand each other perfectly. When could you begin work on the pieces?" "Immediately," the master replied. "The clay is ready, the designs are clear in my mind, and," he glanced at Nikias, "my apprentice is prepared to assist with the more demanding aspects of the work." This casual reference to Nikias's involvement in the commission sent a small thrill of excitement through the young potter. To be considered ready to work on pieces destined for a wealthy household was recognition of his progress that went far beyond simple encouragement. It suggested that Master Kleomenes genuinely trusted his developing skills with projects that could enhance or damage the workshop's reputation. The final details were quickly settled: delivery timeline, payment schedule, specific requirements for packaging and transport. Melania proved to be as efficient in business matters as she was discerning in artistic ones, demonstrating the sort of practical competence that had undoubtedly contributed to her family's commercial success. When she finally departed, with promises to return in 2 weeks to review the work's progress, the workshop seemed to settle back into its comfortable routine with an almost audible sigh of relief. Business negotiations, however successful, always created a certain tension in the creative atmosphere, a reminder that artistic work must ultimately satisfy not only the craftsman's standards but also the customer's expectations. Master Kleomenes stood for a moment in the doorway, watching Melania's retreating figure, then turned back to the workshop with the sort of satisfied expression that comes from securing work that is both challenging and financially rewarding. "Well, Nikias," he said, "it appears you're about to receive an education in the more demanding aspects of pottery production. Wedding commissions leave no room for the sort of generous tolerance we apply to daily practice pieces." This was both warning and opportunity, Nikias realized. The chance to work on pottery destined for public display in a wealthy household was exactly the sort of experience that could accelerate his development from competent apprentice to skilled craftsman. It was also the sort of challenge that could reveal weaknesses in his technique that routine practice might never expose. The afternoon stretched ahead with the promise of serious work. The clay would need to be prepared with particular care, the designs refined from rough sketches into detailed plans, the throwing schedule organized to ensure uniform quality across the entire set. It was the sort of comprehensive project that would test every aspect of their skills while pushing both master and apprentice to perform at their highest level. Aristophanes, having completed his daily fruit acquisition and consumption ritual, had settled into what appeared to be a supervisory meditation. His bright black eye remained alert to workshop activities, but his posture suggested the sort of patient watchfulness that expected excellence and would accept nothing less. The light in the workshop had reached that perfect clarity that potters treasured, bright enough to reveal every detail without creating harsh shadows that might hide flaws or imperfections. It was the sort of light that made clay look noble and significant, transforming humble earth into material worthy of artistic attention. Master Kleomenes began the careful process of selecting clay for the commission, testing different samples for consistency, plasticity, and color. Each piece would need to be thrown from clay that matched not only in working properties but also in its final fired appearance. Variations that might be acceptable in everyday pottery became glaring flaws when multiplied across a complete matching set. "The clay speaks differently when it knows it's destined for important work," the master observed, wedging a particularly fine sample with extra attention. "It seems to understand that mere adequacy is not sufficient." This might have been whimsical metaphor or literal truth. With Master Kleomenes, it was often impossible to tell the difference. But Nikias had learned to trust his teacher's insights about clay's behavior, even when they seemed to venture into the realm of animistic philosophy. As the afternoon light continued its steady progression across the workshop floor, master and apprentice settled into the familiar rhythm of serious pottery work. The wheel spun with purpose, the clay responded with increasing cooperation, and gradually the first pieces of Melania's daughter's wedding set began to take shape beneath their hands. Outside, Athens continued its eternal business of being a great city. Merchants trading, philosophers arguing, politicians scheming, citizens going about the countless daily activities that sustained urban civilization. But within the pottery workshop, time moved to its own ancient rhythm, measured by the patient transformation of earth into art and the quiet satisfaction of skilled hands creating objects that would outlast their makers. Aristophanes maintained his supervisory vigil, occasionally shifting position to better observe the work but never interfering with the serious business of creation. His presence had become so integral to the workshop's atmosphere that Nikias could hardly imagine the space without its feathered philosopher critic. The day's work was far from finished. There were still hours of throwing, trimming, and initial shaping ahead before the pieces would be ready for their first drying phase. But already Nikias could sense the special quality that distinguished commissioned work from practiced pottery. Every movement was more deliberate, every decision more carefully considered, every outcome more significant. As he centered his clay for another piece in the wedding set, Nikias reflected on the morning's progression from simple practice cup to complex professional commission. It seemed to illustrate something fundamental about the nature of craftsmanship, the way that mastery revealed itself not in dramatic leaps but in gradual increases in responsibility, capability, and trust. The potters will spun on, carrying clay toward its destiny as ceramic art, while the afternoon light painted everything in that golden glow that made even the humblest workshop seem touched by divine inspiration. And in that perfect moment of focused creation, with master and apprentice working in harmony under the watchful eye of their avian supervisor, the ancient craft of pottery continued its eternal dialogue between human vision and earthly material,